Hello, reading room. We are here today reading The Case for Christ. But every time I get on here now, I'm going to ask the conservator, Liz, whatever your last name is, who would even know, where's my Social Security? It's been 5 years and you have left a widow without the things she earned, without her reputation, without her husband's Social Security. I have law enforcement creeping all over here, people stalking me, and yet you can't do your job to get me Social Security. My husband's been dead for 5 years. Where's my Social Security? I have people who are paid to be a guardian. I have people who are paid to be conservators, and they are imposters because they have not bothered to get me my things from my home, and they have not bothered to get me my Social Security. It is day 362. It is June 17th, and it's about time that regular citizens started speaking out against this criminal justice system that has no justice. I'm a widow, I'm a woman, I'm a senior citizen. Where is my Social Security from my husband who's been dead for 5 years? Chapter 8, Psychological Evidence. Was Jesus crazy when he allowed people? No, I'm just gullible. That's all that it is. I'm an easy mark. You could see me coming from a mile away. And they did. And law enforcement, sheriffs, what do they care? They don't give one shit. Was Jesus crazy when he claimed to be the Son of God? When a psychologist or psychiatrist testifies, he shall wear a cone-shaped hat that is not less than 2 feet tall. The surface of the hat shall be imprinted with stars and lightning bolts. Additionally, he shall be required to don a white beard that is not less than 18 inches in length and shall punctuate crucial elements of his testimony by stabbing the air with a wand. Whenever a psychologist or psychiatrist provides testimony, the bailiff shall contemporaneously dim the courtroom lights and administer 2 strikes to a Chinese gong. By suggesting this amendment to the state statutes in 1997, New Mexico State Senator Duncan Scott left no doubt about his attitude toward experts who testify that defendants are insane and therefore not legally responsible for their crimes. Apparently, Scott's cynicism was shared by a majority of his colleagues. They voted to approve his tongue-in-cheek proposal. The joke got as far as the House of Representatives, which eventually blocked it from becoming law. Admittedly, there's an undercurrent of skepticism in courthouses over psychiatrists and psychologists who testify concerning the mental state of defendants, their ability to cooperate with their attorney in preparing their defense, and whether they were legally insane at the time they committed their crime. Even so, most lawyers recognize that mental health professionals offer important insights for criminal justice system. I recall a case in which a mild-mannered housewife stood accused of murdering her husband. At first glance, she appears no different from anybody's mother. Well-dressed, pleasant, kindly looking, as if she had just emerged from baking a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies for the neighborhood children. I scoffed when a psychologist testified she was mentally unable to stand trial. Then her lawyer put her on the witness stand. Initially, her testimony was clear, rational, and lucid. However, slowly it became more and more bizarre as she described calmly and with great seriousness how she had been assaulted by a succession of famous individuals, including Dwight Eisenhower and the ghost of Napoleon. By the time she finished, nobody in the courtroom doubted that she was totally out of touch with reality. The judge committed her to a mental institution until she was well enough to face the charges against her. Looks can be deceiving. And so is that criminal justice system. So is this criminal justice system. It's just full of shit over here. That's just full of shit. She gets to stand trial after she's better. Is that what you declared? If she was mentally incompetent, she was mentally incompetent. You don't know what you're saying or doing. The 7th interview, Gary R. Collins, PhD, with the master's degree in psychology from the University of Toronto and a doctorate in clinical psychology from Purdue University. Collins has been studying, teaching, and writing about human behavior for 35 years. He was a professor of psychology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for 2 decades, most of that time as chairman of its psychology division. A live wire with boundless energy and enthusiasm, Collins is a prolific author. He has written nearly 150 articles for journals and other periodicals, and currently is editor of Christian Counseling Today and contributing editor of the Journal of Psychology and Theology. He also has produced an astounding 45 books on psychology-related topics, including The Magnificent Mind, Family Shock, Can You Trust Psychology, and the classic textbook, Christian Counseling, A Comprehensive Guide. In addition, he was general editor of the 30-volume Resources for Christian Counseling, a series of books for mental health professionals. I found Collins in his bright and airy office at the American Association of Christian Counselors, a 15,000-member society of which he is the president. Oh, and yet we make jokes about psychologists, right? Yeah, they're all just what? Trying to get people off for insanity pleas? Maybe that's capitalism. With salt and pepper hair and silver-rimmed glasses, he was looking dapper in a maroon turtleneck sweater, herringbone sports jacket, and gray slacks. But sorry, no pointy hat or flowing white beard. I started our interview by gesturing out the window where snow was gently falling on evergreen trees. A few miles in that direction is a state mental institution, I said. If we were to go over there, I'm sure we'd find some people who claim that they're God. We'd say they were insane. Jesus said he was God. Was he crazy too? If you want the short answer, Collins said with a chuckle, it's no. But I insisted this is a legitimate topic that's worthy of further analysis. Experts say that people suffering from delusional psychosis may appear rational much of the time, yet can have grandiose beliefs that they are superlative individuals. That, you know what, guess what? That's not a reason to murder your husband. That's not somebody who murders their husband, right? So you can sit over there and make these claims about her, whatever. What was her motive? What was her weapon? What is her behavior as far as criminal violence goes? What's her behavior as far as criminal violence goes? What? Did she say a few nasty words? A few miles in that direction is a state mental institution, I said. If we were, all right, I already read all that. Experts say that people suffering from delusional psychosis may appear rational much of the time. They can have grandiose beliefs that they are superlative individuals. Some can even attract followers who believe they're geniuses. Maybe that's what happened with Jesus, I suggested. Well, it's true that people with psychological difficulties will often claim to be somebody they're not. That certainly doesn't contribute to violence. That is not evidence for violence. But what do you guys care about evidence? Collins replied as he elapsed his hands behind his head. They'll sometimes claim to be Jesus himself, or the President of the United States, or someone else famous, like Lee Strobel, he quipped. However, he continued, psychologists don't just look at what a person says. They'll go much deeper than that. They'll look at person's emotions because disturbed individuals frequently show inappropriate depression, or they might be vehemently angry, which could be appropriate. 5 years without Social Security, living in this God-forsaken place without half of my things? Where are they? Or perhaps they're plagued with anxiety. But look at Jesus. He never demonstrated inappropriate emotions. For instance, he cried at the death of his friend Lazarus. That's natural for an emotionally healthy individual. He certainly got angry at times, I asserted. Yes, he did, but it was a healthy kind of anger at people taking advantage of widows, senior women, taking full advantage. Full advantage. Where are my things? Where's my Social Security? 5 years. I think I've been patient. I think I've been pretty patient. Taking advantage of the downtrodden by lining their top pockets at the temple. He wasn't just irrationally ticked off because someone was annoying him. This was a righteous reaction against injustice and the blatant mistreatment of people. Other deluded people will have misperceptions, he added. They think people are watching them or trying to get them when they're not. I'd say without Social Security, without my home, without my reputation, while law enforcement officials did nothing about the complaints of those construction workers destroying my property, about somebody jacking off behind my back, I think there are people watching or trying to get me. But here it says, when they're not. They're out of contact with reality. They misperceive the actions of other people and accuse them of doing things they have no intention of ever doing. Again, we don't see this in Jesus. He was obviously in contact with reality. He wasn't paranoid, although he rightfully understood that there were some very real dangers around him. Or people with psychological difficulties may have thinking disorders. They can't carry on a logical conversation. They'll jump to faulty conclusions. They're irrational. We don't see this in Jesus. He spoke clearly, powerfully, and eloquently. He was brilliant and had absolutely amazing insights into human nature. Another sign of mental disturbances is unsuitable behavior, such as dressing oddly or being unable to relate socially to others. Jesus' behavior was quite in line with what would be expected, and he had deep and abiding relationships with the wide variety of people from different walks of life. So did I, until you wrecked my reputation and isolated me. He paused, although I sensed he wasn't finished yet. I prompted him to continue by asking, "What else do you observe about him?" Collins gazed out the window at the beautiful and peaceful snow-blanketed landscape. When he resumed, it was as if he were reminiscing about an old friend. He was loving, but didn't let his compassion immobilize him. He didn't have a bloated ego, even though he was often surrounded by adoring crowds. He maintained balance despite an often demanding lifestyle. He always knew what he was doing and where he was going. He cared deeply about people, including women and children, who weren't seen as being important back then. He was able to accept people while not merely winking at their sin. He responded to individuals based on where they were at and what they uniquely needed. No response about what my complaints are, which are valid complaints. No response at all. No movement to address what I've said about those criminals on my property how long ago, about that sheriff who came to my door and asked to go up to my bedroom while he was stomping all over my plants. "So, doctor, your diagnosis," I asked. "All in all, I don't see signs that Jesus was suffering from any known mental illness," he concluded, adding with a smile, "He was much healthier than anyone else I know, including me." Raving mad. Granted, as we look back through history, we don't see obvious signs of delusion in Jesus. But what about people who were directly interacting with him? What did they see from their much closer vantage point? Some people who were on the scene in the first century would vehemently disagree with you, I pointed out to Collins. They did conclude that Jesus was crazy. John 10:20, chapter 10, verse 20 tells us that many Jews thought he was demon-possessed and raving mad. Those are strong words. Yes, but that's hardly a diagnosis by a trained mental health professional, Collins countered. Look at what prompted those words. Jesus' moving and profound teaching about being the good shepherd. They were reacting because his assertions about himself were so far beyond their understanding of the norm, not because Jesus was truly mentally unbalanced. And notice that their comments were immediately challenged by others who said in verse 21, "These are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" Why is that significant? I asked. Because Jesus wasn't just making outrageous claims about himself. He was backing them with miraculous acts of compassion, like healing the blind. You see, if I claimed to be the President of the United States, that would be crazy. You'd look at me and see none of the trappings of the office of president. I wouldn't look like the president. People wouldn't accept my authority as president. No Secret Service agents would be guarding me. But if the real president claimed to be president, that wouldn't be crazy because he is president, and there would be plenty of confirming evidence of that. In an analogous way, Jesus didn't just claim to be God. He backed it up with amazing feats of healing, with astounding demonstrations of power over nature, with transcendent and unprecedented teaching, with divine insights into people, and ultimately with his own resurrection from the dead, which absolutely nobody else had been able to duplicate. So when Jesus claimed to be God, it wasn't crazy, it was the truth. However, Collins, and you know what the truth is? The truth is I'm a widow, I'm a senior citizen, and I'm sitting here with a great reputation, and I'm a great psychologist, and yet I have been, I think, pretty patient and pretty understanding and pretty kind about the fact that my things and reputation was completely stolen from me. By who? By who? Those sheriffs don't care. They don't care one single bit. Some people have tried to shoot down these miracles that supposedly help authenticate Jesus' claim to being the Son of God. I said, pulling out a book from my briefcase, I read him the words of a skeptic, Charles Templeton. He keeps going back to Charles Templeton. It's like, I like him because he really did come up with some really, Lee Strobel, he really did come up with some really great questions. Normal, I'm not the smartest person on the planet, questions. But that Charles Templeton really did get in his craw. My illnesses then as now were psychosomatic and could be cured when the sufferer's perception changed, just as today a placebo prescribed by a physician in whom the patient has faith can affect an apparent cure. So in an early time, faith in the healer could banish adverse symptoms. With each success, the healer's reputation would grow and his powers would, as a consequence, become more efficacious. Does this, I demanded, explain away the miracles that supposedly backed up Jesus' claim to being the Son of God? Collins's reaction surprised me. I wouldn't have a whole lot of disagreement with that, Templeton wrote. Collins replied, you wouldn't? Not really. Might Jesus have sometimes healed by suggestion? I have no problem with that. Sometimes people can have a psychological induced illness, and if they get a new purpose for living, a new direction, get their things back, have people actually accountable for their criminal behavior by law enforcement, they don't need the illness anymore. The placebo effect, if you think you're going to get better, you often do get better. That's a well-established medical fact. And when people came to Jesus, they believed he could heal them. So he did. But the fact remains, regardless of how he did it, Jesus did heal them. Of course, he quickly added, that doesn't explain all of Jesus's healings. Often a psychosomatic healing takes time. Jesus's healings were spontaneous. And by the way, there are supposed mental health facilitators who went ahead and allowed somebody who called himself my son to be my guardian. What do they care? What do they care? What they want to do is shut up a positive health psychologist because she really might be able to improve people's mental illness and mental health without using their poisonous drugs. Now there's a motivation. Law enforcement, ding-a-lings. Many times people who are healed psychologically have their symptoms return a few days later, but we don't see any evidence of this. And Jesus healed conditions like lifelong blindness and leprosy, for which a psychosomatic explanation isn't very likely. On top of that, he brought people back from the dead, and death is not a psychologically induced state. Plus, you have all his nature miracles, the calming of the sea, turning water into wine. They defy naturalistic answers. Well, maybe. However, Collins's mention of the miracle of turning water into wine brought up another possible explanation of Jesus's amazing feats. Jesus the hypnotist. Have you ever seen a strange hypnotist give water to someone they've put in a trance and then suggest to them that they were drinking wine? They smack their lips, they get giddy, they start feeling intoxicated just as if they were swigging a cheap Bordeaux. British author Ian Wilson has raised the question of whether this is how Jesus convinced the wedding guests at Cana that he had transformed jugs of water into the finest fermented libation. In fact, Wilson discusses the possibility that Jesus may have been a master hypnotist, which could explain the supposedly supernatural aspects of his life, but wouldn't explain the supernatural aspects or consequences after his death, now would it? For instance, hypnosis could account for his exorcisms, his transfiguration, during which 3 of his followers saw his face glow and his garments shine as white as light, and even his healings as evidence. Wilson cites the modern example of a 16-year-old boy whose serious skin disorder was inexplicably healed through hypnotic suggestion. Perhaps Lazarus wasn't really brought back from the dead. Couldn't he have been in a death-like trance that had been induced by hypnosis? As for the, well, you know what, he was buried by his sister and family, Lazarus was, and they didn't want him to go by his tomb. So that doesn't make any sense. As for the resurrection, Jesus could have effectively conditioned the disciples to hallucinate his appearances in response to certain prearranged cues, the breaking of bread for a predetermined period after his death, Wilson speculated. This would explain the enigmatic reference in the Gospels to Jesus' inability to perform many miracles in his hometown of Nazareth, said Wilson. Jesus failed precisely where, as a hypnotist, we would most expect him to fail among those who knew him best, those who had seen him grow up as an ordinary child, largely responsible for any hypnotist's success rate, are the awe and mystery with which he surrounds himself, and these essential factors would have been entirely lacking in Jesus' hometown. You have to admit, I said to Collins, this is a rather interesting way of trying to explain away Jesus' miracles. It's interesting, but it's not factful, is it? There was a book of incredulity. There was a look of incredulity. I think that's on his face. This guy has a whole lot more faith in hypnosis than I do, he exclaimed. While it's a clever argument, it just doesn't stand up to analysis. It's full of holes. One by one, Collins began to enumerate them. First, there's the problem of a whole bunch of people being hypnotized. Not everybody is equally susceptible. Stage hypnotists will talk in a certain soothing tone of voice to the audience and watch for people who seem to be responding, and they'll pick these people as their volunteers because they're readily susceptible to hypnosis. In a big group, many people are resistant. When Jesus multiplied the bread and fish, there were 5,000 witnesses. How could he have hypnotized them all? Second, hypnosis doesn't generally work on people who are skeptics and doubters. So how did Jesus hypnotize his brother James, who doubted him but later saw the resurrected Christ? How did How did he hypnotize Saul of Tarsus, the opponent of Christianity, who never even met Jesus until he saw him after his resurrection? How did he hypnotize Thomas, who was so skeptical he wouldn't believe the resurrection until he put his fingers in the nail holes of Jesus's hands? Third, concerning the resurrection, hypnosis wouldn't explain the empty tomb. I jumped in. I suppose someone could claim that the disciples had been hypnotized to imagine the tomb was empty, I offered. Even if that were possible, Collins replied, Jesus certainly couldn't have hypnotized the Pharisees and Roman authorities, and they would have gladly produced his body if it remained in the tomb. The fact that they didn't tell us the tomb was really empty. The fact that they didn't tell us That's not a complete sentence. Fourth, look at the miracle of turning water into wine. Jesus never addressed the wedding guests. He didn't even suggest to the servants that the water had been turned into wine. He merely told them to take some water to the master of the banquet. He's the one who tasted it and said it was wine with no prior prompting. Fifth, the skin healing that Wilson talks about wasn't spontaneous, was it? Actually, I said, the British Medical Journal says it took 5 days after the hypnosis for the reptilian skin, called ichthyosis, to fall off the teenager's left arm, and several more days for the skin to appear normal. The hypnotic success rate for dealing with other parts of his body over a period of several weeks was 50 to 95%. Compare that, Collins said, with Jesus' healing 10 lepers in Luke 17. They were instantaneously healed and 100%. That's not explainable merely by hypnosis, and neither is his healing of a man with a shriveled hand in Mark 3. Even if people were in a trance and merely thought his hand had been healed, eventually they would have found out the truth. Hypnosis doesn't last a real long time. And finally, the Gospels record all sorts of details about what Jesus said and did, but never once do they portray him as saying or doing anything that would suggest he was hypnotizing people. I could go on and on. I laughed. Look at who stole my home. It's not really that difficult. Who stole my home? I laughed. I told you it was an interesting explanation. I didn't say it was convincing, I said. Yet books are being written in advance to advance these kinds of ideas. It's just amazing to me, Collins replied, how people will grasp at anything to try and prove their biases and disprove Jesus' miracles. Jesus the Exorcist. Before we finished our interview, I wanted to tap into Collins's psychological expertise in one more area that skeptics find troubling. Jesus was an exorcist, I observed. He talked to demons and cast them out of the people they supposedly possessed. But is it really rational to believe that evil spirits are responsible for some illnesses and bizarre behavior? Collins wasn't disturbed by the question. From my theological beliefs, I accept that demons exist, he replied. We live in a society in which many people believe in angels. I believe demons exist. That's why I use the word. I use it all the time. A bunch of demons around me. Satan himself. They know there are spiritual forces out there, and it's not too hard to conclude that some might be malevolent. Where you see God working, sometimes those forces are more active, and that's what was probably going on in the time of Jesus. I noticed Collins had referred to his theological beliefs and not his clinical experience. Have you, as a psychologist, ever seen clear evidence of the demonic? I asked. I haven't personally, but then I haven't spent my whole career in clinical settings, he said. I haven't either. I mean, both of those things. I believe that if there's good forces, there are bad forces. And if those forces that are good are spiritual, then so are those bad forces, right? I do believe that. My friends in clinical work have said that sometimes they have seen this, and these are not people who are inclined to see a demon behind every problem. They tend to be skeptical. The psychiatrist M. Scott Peck wrote, I was wondering if this was going to be brought up, wrote a bit about this kind of thing in his book, People of the Lie. I've read that book twice. It's disturbing. He comes to some conclusions that I just don't agree with at all. And then he calls them demonic. I would have to agree with Collins. I pointed out that Ian Wilson, in suggesting that Jesus may have used hypnosis to cure people who only believed they were possessed, said dismissively that no realistic individual would explain a state of possession as the work of real demons. To some degree, you find what you set out to find, Collins said in response. People who deny the existence of the supernatural will find some way, no matter how far-fetched, to explain a situation apart from the demonic. They'll keep giving medication, keep drugging the person, but he or she doesn't get better. There are cases that don't respond to normal medical or psychiatric treatment. Could Jesus' exorcisms really have been psychosomatic healing? I asked. Yes, in some cases. But again, you have to look at the whole context. What about the man who was possessed and Jesus sent the demons into the pigs and the pigs ran off the cliff? What's going on if that was a psychosomatic situation? I think Jesus really did drive out demons, and I think some people do that today. At the same time, we shouldn't be too quick to jump to a demonic conclusion when faced with the recalcitrant problem. As C.S. Lewis put it, there are two equal and opposite errors we can fall into concerning demons. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased with both errors. You know, Gary, that idea might fly with the American Association of Christian Counselors, but would secular psychologists consider it rational to believe in the demonic, I asked. Those are really good questions he's pursuing, I think. It is interesting, isn't it? I mean, I believe in the demonic because I believe in God. And he told us so. But have I seen it? No, I haven't. I've seen regular, everyday people act as criminals and be guided by their own lack of consciousness. Of conscience. Conscience. That was the right word, not consciousness. I thought Collins might take offense at this question, which came out sounding more condescending than I had intended, but he didn't. It's interesting how things are changing, he mused. Our society today is caught up in spirituality. That's a term that can mean almost anything, but it does recognize the supernatural. It's very interesting what psychologists are believing in these days. Some are into Eastern mythical stuff. Some talk about the power of shamans to influence people's lives. Whereas 25 years ago, the suggestion of demonic activity would have been immediately dismissed, many psychologists are beginning to recognize that maybe there are more things in heaven and earth than our philosophies can account for. Preposterous imaginations. Collins and I had drifted a bit from the original point of our interview. As I thought about our talk while I was driving home, I returned to the central issue that had brought me to him. Jesus claimed to be God. Nobody is suggesting he was intentionally deceptive. And now Collins has concluded, based on 35 years of psychological experience, that he was not mentally impaired. However, that left me with a new question. Did Jesus fulfill the attributes of God? After all, it's one thing to claim divinity. It's quite another to embody the characteristics that make God God. What another great point, right? So I can believe in demonic spirits. I can believe in criminals who have taken advantage of me because I am absolutely a gullible, easy target. But the real question is, has Jesus, not claiming to be one and the same, demonstrated godly characteristics? At a stoplight, I pulled a notebook out of my briefcase and scrawled a note to myself, tracked down D.A. Carson. I knew that I'd want to talk to one of the country's leading theologians about this next matter. In the meantime, my talk with Gary Collins prompted me to spend time that night carefully rereading the Discourse of Jesus. I could detect no sign of dementia, delusions, or paranoia. On the contrary, I was moved once more by his profound wisdom, his uncanny insights, his poetic eloquence, and his deep compassion. Historian Philip Schaff said it better than I can. And such an intellect, clear as the sky, bracing as the mountain air, sharp and penetrating as the sword, thoroughly healthy and vigorous, always ready and always self-possessed, liable to a radical and most serious delusion concerning his own character and mission, preposterous imagination. My mission here came long before the criminals. The criminals came after I was becoming more and more successful with my mission. Questions for reflection. These are deliberations. What are some of the differences between a patient in a mental hospital claiming to be God and Jesus making the same assertion about himself? Read Jesus' teaching called the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. What observations can you make about his intellect, eloquence, compassion, insight into human nature, ability to teach profound truths, and overall psychological health? Let's take a look at that really quickly. Matthew chapter 5. Verses 1 through 12. These are pretty quick. Blessed are the poor in spirit. They make me weep. They do. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And then the last question. Having read Collins' response to the theory that hypnosis can account for Jesus' miracles, do you believe this is a viable hypothesis? Why or why not? Let's look at chapter 9. Oh, chapter 9 is longer. So I will wait until Tuesday to get to chapter 9. Chapter 9 is the profile evidence. I also love the way that Lee Strobel titles his chapters. It makes it almost easier for you to memorize. If you memorized the table of contents, you'd have the eyewitness evidence, the testing the eyewitness evidence, the documentary evidence, the corroborating evidence, the scientific evidence, the rebuttal evidence, the identity evidence, the psychological evidence, the profile evidence, the fingerprint evidence, the medical evidence, the evidence of the missing body, the evidence of appearances, and the circumstantial evidence. So if you were to memorize that table of contents, you would be able to memorize each one of the points that he was making for each one of those chapters. It's not necessarily my thing, because I'm not an apologist, right? I'm not apologetic about some of those things that I'm saying about the guardian. Who's that guardian? Not my son. That's an imposter. That's an imposter sent in by McLaren to watch me for how many years? 2 years is what you basically put me on mental health probation, is what it is. It is deplorable who you are. It is deplorable who you are. This program director who's supposed to be overseeing what is going on, it is deplorable who these people are. They are deplorable. You know, you saw Amiri. I know you saw Amiri, that they had no evidence for what they were doing. It is deplorable what you stand for. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Oh, wait, Amy Lynn Hall too, because she's the one. But she was forced to do that. Amy Lynn Hall, I have at least a little bit of sympathy for, because I believe that she was forced to do that. I don't know. I do know people have been lying to me about who they are their whole life, and some of those people are relatives. Dr. Annette Feravich, thanks so much for joining me here. Hey, listen. I don't have some kind of bubble around me that would prevent these criminals from being part of my life. I don't have some bubble around me that would prevent these criminals from being part of my family. Clearly, I have seen abuse. All my life, I have seen abuse. So I have no bubble around me to keep those criminals out of my life or out of my family. But I do have a mission that has nothing to do with that. And that mission puts people in a real compromising position, a real challenge to who they are as Christians, who they are to God, whether or not they decide to no longer believe in God because of the choices that they made. It puts their conscience in a compromising position. Dr. Annette Feravich, it is day 362. It is Wednesday, June 17th. Thank you so much for joining me here in the classroom, where I am always working hard to find these criminals who are derailing widows, who are ruining the reputation of good women who are teachers. That Mackey guy, MD, where'd you get your degree from? The West Indies? Dr. Annette Feravich, thanks so much for joining me here in the classroom. Let's get rid of all that crap. Criminals, criminals, criminals. We are reading The Case for Christ. We will come back here on Tuesday with chapter 9. Thanks again for joining me, where every effort I make is to make sure that we have a healthier mind, a healthier body, a healthier spirit, healthier law enforcement, a healthier country that works on the Constitution and real democracy. Thanks so much for joining me.